Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to come and share with you this morning. Consider it a privilege and an honor to be here. Last time I was here, you were in the other building across the plaza there, and so this is such a treat to see and a wonderful building, and I'm excited for you, and I commend you for the hard work and the investment that you've put into the work of the kingdom here in this place, and so I commend you for that. Is the microphone working? Here we go. Now it is. Okay, so now it is. Did you hear anything I said up to then? Yeah. Well, what I want to do is before I launch into my message, I want to read the passage from Esther. And if you look at the back of the bulletin, you can see that Esther 4, 1-14 will be read, and then Ephesians 2:10. So let me just start with a reading from Esther. It's in the Old Testament, and it's in the middle of the book, but I'll explain some of the context as I go through. So here we go. When Mordecai learned what had been done, so what had been done was there was a person named Haman who was scheming to see the Jews killed and wanted to see the Jews destroyed in Persia. And so Mordecai just found out about that, and he's alarmed. And that's where we are in the story. So he tore his clothes, dressed in mourning clothes, and put ashes on his head. Then he went out into the heart of the city and cried out loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, because it was against the law for anyone who passed through it wearing mourning clothes. At the same time, in every province and place where the king's order, that's the king's order justifying the killing of Jews, where the king's order had been, and his new law arrived, a very great sadness came over the Jews. They gave up eating and spent whole days weeping and crying out loudly in pain. Many Jews lay on the ground in mourning clothes and ashes. When Esther's female servants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, the queen's whole body showed how upset she was. She sent everyday clothes for Mordecai to wear instead of mourning clothes, but he rejected them. Esther is Mordecai's daughter, adopted daughter. And she's the queen now at this stage. Esther then sent for Hathach, one of the royal eunuchs, whose job it was to wait on her. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was going on and why he was acting this way. Hathach went out to Mordecai, to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him. He spelled out the exact amount of silver that Haman promised to pay into the royal treasury. It was in exchange for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave Hathach a copy of the law made public in Susa concerning the Jews' destruction, so that Hathach could show it to Esther and report it to her. Through him, Mordecai offered her to go to the king to seek his kindness and his help for her people. Hathach came back and told Esther what Mordecai had said. In reply, Esther ordered Hathach to tell Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people in the province know that there's a single law in a case like this. Any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner courtyard without being called is to be put to death. Only the person to whom the king holds out the gold scepter may live. In my case, I haven't been called to come to the king for the past 30 days. When they told Mordecai Esther's words, he had them respond to Esther. Don't think for 1 minute that, unlike all the other Jews, you will come out of this alive simply because you were in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place. But you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be part of the royal family. Esther sent back this word to Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and tell them to give up eating to help me be brave. They aren't to eat or drink anything for 3 whole days, and I myself will do the same, along with my female servants. Then, even though it is against the law, I will go to the king, and if I am to die, then I will die. So Mordecai left where he was and did exactly what Esther had ordered him to do. And then Ephesians, jumping to the New Testament, just one verse. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. We spend a lot of time at work. If you do the math, it's quite scary actually. If you work an 8-hour day, 40 hours a week, that's 160 hours a month. That's 1,920 hours a year. That's 19,200 hours in a decade. And if you work just a mere 4 decades, many people work longer, 4 decades is 76,800 hours. That's a lot of hours at work. That could be roughly a quarter or a third of one's lifetime. And then if you combine sleeping with that, not sleeping at work, but if you add sleeping as what you do in life, which could be another third or a quarter of your life, that's a huge chunk of your life, either sleeping or at work. We spend a huge amount of time at work, and sometimes we can wonder whether or not what we do at work matters. Is what we do for a big chunk of our lives one big waste of time? Complicating such a question or pondering is what Paul says to the Ephesians. I just read it. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. So God has prepared things for us to do as Christians. But when is there time to do that work? A quarter of our life, a third of our life is on the job. And then the other quarter or third is sleeping. When do we do this work that God has created us to do? Complicating things even further is that most of us want to have a life that matters. Yet the way we talk about God's call and elevate certain jobs makes people feel like they are wasting their life and not serving God. So what do? We want to serve God, but we work at the same time. So how do we bring those things together? Well, a way forward is to learn from 2 people. And those 2 people would be Esther, looking for my clicker here, Esther and William Wilberforce. Esther lived 2,400 years ago, roughly, in Persia, Western Iran, in the ancient Near East. So it's a long ago period of time. William Wilberforce lived roughly 200 years ago in Britain. And they are 2 people. One lived in a palace, Esther lived in a palace, and one served in a parliament, William Wilberforce. And there is much we can learn about work from Esther and William Wilberforce. And so I want to talk, go back, about Esther and Wilberforce. So the story of Esther. It's a fascinating one. It's well known. If you've been in the faith a long time, you're familiar with the story. There was a king of Persia. Ahasuerus is his name. It's an odd name. It's hard to pronounce. He needed a new wife since his original wife, Queen Vashti, had refused to dance at his party. He had all these nobles, and he wanted to impress everyone with his beautiful wife. And so he said, "Oh, dance." And she refused to dance in front of the nobles. And so out with her, and he wanted a new queen. And so he wanted the most beautiful queen in all the land, or the most beautiful woman in all the land. So he sent out this call, and all the beautiful women in the land were rounded up. And for a year that they were prepared to go before the king. And Esther, who was a Jew, was one of these women. And so she's there. She goes before the king, and he chooses her, and she becomes the queen. Now, no one knows she's a Jew. And her father, Mordecai, no one knows originally that he's a Jew. But Mordecai's a Jew, and Esther's a Jew, but nobody knows. But then there's a plot. There's this man named Haman who wants to kill the Jews. Read the text, you'll find out why. He's deeply offended. He's insulted, and so he wants not just to get one, he wants to kill them all. But he doesn't know the queen is a Jew. And so now Esther's scheming. She's thinking, should I go before? Not scheming, she's thinking. Then she has to scheme. We'll get to that. She's thinking, do I go before the king? And we read in the text that you can't just go before the king. She's the queen, but you can't just say, hey, king, something's on my mind. People want to kill my people. She can't. The king has to invite her. And if she's not invited, she can still go. But if he's upset, if he doesn't acknowledge her presence, she can be killed, even though she's the queen. And so this is the tension, this is the pressure that Mordecai is putting on her. He's saying, Esther, Esther, you need to go to the king and stop the execution of your people. And Esther says, this is sort of a Gord Heath paraphrase, if I go, I could die. And Mordecai says, but maybe God has put you in this place for this very reason, to go before the king and to save your people. And so the question for Esther at work on her job is, do I go? Do I go before the king? And that's what faces Esther. William Wilberforce. Wilberforce, you probably have heard of him. He graduated from Cambridge in 1779 at the age of 20. He ran for office for a year later and became a member of Parliament at the age of 21. And then he remained in office for the next 45 years. So he was a career politician. He stayed in basically all his life. Very gifted, with a promising future ahead of him. One summary of his strengths reads this way. Two of Wilberforce's most appealing qualities were his engaging personality and his eloquent speaking voice. Useful traits for a politician. He was so famous for his public speaking that he was nicknamed the Nightingale of the Commons. And he quickly reacquainted himself with his university friend William Pitt, who was also an MP, who would also become Prime Minister. And those two young men, William Wilberforce and William Pitt, began to make their mark in Parliament. So now he's a politician. Now Wilberforce had been a nominal Anglican. Really, faith wasn't all that much to him. But in 1785, while serving as a parliamentarian, he converted to Methodism, and his faith became real. And in the weeks that followed, he struggled with what to do. Should he leave politics? He wanted to serve God. He wanted to do it, to do God's will in his life. And so he thought, can I do this as a politician? He wanted to serve God, but he struggled with what to do. Should he leave politics, that shady, gray, and cutthroat world? Or should he serve God in the church? Well, he wanted to serve God, but he didn't know what to do. Should he stay? For Esther, it was, should she go? Should she go before the king? But for Wilberforce, should I stay? Should I stay as a parliamentarian and stay in Parliament? Those are the questions that they both were facing. Do I go? Do I stay? Well, Esther went. As the story of Esther indicates, she decided to go before the king. And I encourage you to read the book of Esther today or this week. It's an easy book to read. It's only 9 chapters, and it's a compelling story. But as the story indicates, she decided to go before the king and started her plans to save her people. It's an engaging story. I can't go into all of it this morning. Suffice it to say, she was successful. And she averted a disaster. And her bold and courageous actions in the palace led to the salvation of the Jews. And every year since then, for over 2,000 years, Jews have celebrated the festival of Purim in March or April, in memory of the victory and in honor of Esther and her courage in saving the Jews. And so she went. In the middle of her work was the palace, but she went and saved the Jews. William Wilberforce. The slave trade in the 18th century involved tens of thousands of slaves, hundreds of ships, millions of pounds, and upon it depended the economies of Britain and much of Europe. After a period of struggle, Wilberforce decided to stay in politics, and commit his life to the abolition of the slave trade. It took decades of his life, but eventually slavery was abolished in the British Empire. Whereas Esther's bold and brave actions in the palace led to the salvation of the Jews, Wilberforce's bold and brave actions in Parliament led to the salvation of the slaves. And Wilberforce's name lives on. In the names of countless babies born, towns and roads and monuments. And he is buried in Westminster Abbey in London, in England. There's much that we can learn about work and about serving God from the lives of Esther and Wilberforce. And what I want to do in the time that I have left is talk about the myths that we can avoid and the lessons we can learn from these two who served God in the midst of their workplace. One was a palace, one was Parliament, and my hunch is most of us will not serve God in a palace or Parliament, as wonderful as that would be, but we still work, and we still have a place where we carry out our daily functions. And we can learn a great deal from Esther and from Wilberforce. And so that's what I want us to do, is to look at myths to avoid and lessons to be learned from looking at these two figures. So, first of all, myths to avoid. Well, there are three interrelated myths that we have to avoid. One myth is that there's a ranking of callings or vocations. That God calls people, but some callings are better than others. That you're called to this, yeah, you can do this, you can do that, you can do whatever. But there's certain callings and certain vocations that are better, that are superior to others. That's a myth we need to be careful of. God's call is always to be carried out in the church. That if God's going to call you to do something, He's going to call you to do it within these four walls. He doesn't call us to do something outside of these four walls. It's always inside the church. And God's call is always about preaching the gospel, always verbalizing the gospel. Those are myths. Those are, there's truth mixed in, but let me clarify what I'm saying. I've had many jobs. I listed them here. I was struck. Started as a kid, mowing lawns, church janitor, plumber's assistant, lobster fishing, apprentice auto mechanic, legislative usher, security guard, residence advisor, residence director, service and installation of soap dispensers in restaurants, painter, library staff. Whoa! Then I was a pastor, ordained minister for years, and then I became a professor. So lots of jobs, lots of vocations, lots of things that I did. But only one of those jobs, only one of that list was special. Right? That's how it's often portrayed. Only one of those jobs was a special job in God's eyes. The rest were just jobs. Only one special. Guess which one it was? Pastoring. The others were just jobs. Pastoring, that is seen to be the highest calling, the most important, and God really doesn't care about anything else other than whether you're called to be a pastor. Let me illustrate how this plays out. So I'm an ordained Baptist minister, served as pastor for years. I'm still ordained, but now I'm professor. So I'm talking to some family members, and they say to me, Gord, when are you going to get back into ministry? Back into ministry. I didn't know I was out of ministry. So here I am at a seminary teaching church history, training Christian leaders, but in their opinion, I wasn't really doing ministry because I wasn't a pastor. I wasn't really doing ministry. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, that the only real call that matters is the call of a pastor, and everything else, the stuff that everyone else outside of this first row in the church is doing is secondary. It's not really all that important in God's eyes. The front row is where it's at, right? Or up here. But everything else, second-class citizens at best, right? That's what you're doing. That's a myth. But we see that played out. The problem with that view is that it's not biblical. It's just bad theology. Protestants, in particular, rejected the notion that there's an elite class of Christians, priests, monks, or nuns, and believed that all work in the world was a concern of God, and all callings were equally valid. As one author writes, all Christians have callings or vocations, and that all callings are equal in moral and religious seriousness. They only differ in function. Yes, there are different functions. There's pastors and this and that. But the callings are equal with different functions. Martin Luther, that great German reformer, the 16th century, wrote, "The maid who sweeps her kitchen is doing the will of God just as much as the monk who prays. Not because she may sing a Christian hymn as she sweeps, but because God loves clean floors." He's making a point. The Christian shoemaker does his Christian duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship. Luther's point is that all the work that we do is important in God's eyes. There's no hierarchy of callings. Pastor, and then everybody else beneath that. No, all these callings God sees as valuable. Different functions, but valuable callings. To think that there is only a real calling, to think that the only real calling or service in the kingdom is in the church is to miss the critical point that God sees the places that we work and the things that we do in work as areas for service and carrying out our calling. And also misses the truth that God may have us in our work, for a reason. Just as Esther was there for a reason. Just as Wilberforce was there for a reason. And so, if we had lots of time, if this were a classroom, I'd get you to shout out your work, like where everyone works. And there'd be, a lot of different places of work that were shouted out. And the Christian view is that God has a plan and a place for you in your work. And you have a vocation and you have a calling as a Christian in your place of work, as Esther did and as Wilberforce did, to make a mark in your place of work. Don't consider what you do an inferior calling from God. It's not a second-class calling. It is a call and a vocation where you serve and where you work. We see this in the account of Esther. Mordecai tried to convince Esther to do something, but she originally balked. Of course, she's afraid. She's afraid to act because she could lose her head. Mordecai finally raised the idea of calling. He said, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." When Wilberforce pondered what to do with his political career, he finally turned to the aged John Newton, who was an ex-slave trader, turned pastor and hymn writer. Echoing the wisdom of Mordecai, Newton said this to Wilberforce: "It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation." The assumption in both cases was that God had raised a person up in his or her work, in the workforce, to carry out his plan and purposes in the palace or parliament or wherever. And so we need to note that God works through pastors, through church leaders, but also God works in where you work. And that is a calling and a vocation that you need to see as something valued by God in a place where you can serve in the kingdom. There is no ordinary work. There is no just a job. For one's work is one's calling. It is, as one author writes, a summons from God for engagement in the world, in humble service to your neighbor. The example of Esther and Wilberforce, who's not there anymore, compels us to rethink what a calling is. Any jobs of caring, building, parenting, restoring, creating, thinking, planning, serving, organizing, leading, planting, nursing, preaching are equally all callings or vocations from God. We do not have to preach, as important as preaching is. We do not have to preach to be living out a meaningful call on our lives. Not everyone will preach, and that's fine. Not everyone is called to preach. But where you serve, you have your calling. And it's an equal calling. It's not a secondary calling. It's an equal calling in God's eyes. And all of these ways of serving are ways of loving one's neighbor, contributing to human flourishing, to bringing love and grace and mercy and justice into the workplace, and being a godly witness and a compelling witness for the gospel in one's workplace, as Esther was as a Jew and in Wilberforce as a Christian. And so we need to recognize these myths when they come up. And so when my family says, Gord, when are you going to go back into the ministry? I can say what? I am in the ministry. And you are in the ministry too. Oh, no, I'm not in the ministry. They would say, you are in the ministry. You're in business. You're in this. You're a mother. You're a father. You're a business person. You're a police officer. You're a magistrate. You're a computer tech. You're whatever. These are all areas of service. So those are some myths to avoid. And it's important to avoid these myths because they can be very demotivating and undermine a sense of purpose. Because when you read Ephesians 2:10, you read that God saved you to do what? To do works. But if you say, I got no time to do the work of God because I work. No. It's one and the same. Do your work in your place of work. Do the work that God's called you to do where you work. That is God's calling on your life. And don't see it as second class. Don't see it as unimportant in God's eyes. Because it's very important. And so take these myths and jettison those myths. So some lessons learned as we get close to wrapping things up. Some myths to avoid, but there are some lessons to learn from the lives of Esther and Wilberforce. And if we're going to take our faith seriously in our workplace, these are some lessons to be learned. Because it's difficult to take your faith seriously in a workplace. Esther could tell you that. She could lose her life. Wilberforce could tell you that. Incredible struggles that he faced. And so if you're going to take your faith seriously and see this place as a place of calling, you need to learn from Esther and learn from Wilberforce. So what can we learn? I'll just run through these quickly. Some I'll spend a little more time on. We need discernment. Esther and Wilberforce did not just drift into what they did. They were careful, they were calculated, and made a decision after talking, fasting, and praying beforehand. And the need for this is imperative if you're going to seek to make any changes that buck up against power. Esther, before she made a decision, she said to Mordecai, 3 days, you need to talk to every Jew you know and have the entire community fasting before she made a decision. We need discernment, but we need to get people to pray for us so that we're wise and able. Wilberforce took time and he sought out counsel from his friend as well as the pastor, John Newton. And we need wisdom. These two are related, discernment and wisdom. Just because God is on our side does not mean we can be foolish. Christians have this strange notion sometimes that because right is on their side, they can just say whatever they want to say whenever they want to say it because God's on their side. Esther was not that foolish. Esther was very careful. She sought the community's support, community discernment, and she was very calculated in how she went about the gilded halls of power because she knew one false step and her life could be over. And so we need to be wise. Yes, we need to speak truth, but we need to be careful. Just because God is on our side does not mean we can be stupid and careless. That's just presumption. We're presuming God will save us from our foolishness. No, we need to be careful. We need to be wise. We need the right people. Esther had Mordecai, her father, and a man of courage, faith, and wisdom who spoke into her life, pushed her, challenged her. Now, that's a brave father. I have a daughter. I have a son. I have a daughter. To think that I would push my daughter into making a decision that could cause her to lose her life, I don't know if I'd even have the courage and wisdom and faith or anything. I'd be like, quit that job. Come live with me. Be safe. Don't do anything risky because I'm a protective dad. But Mordecai's like, no, you're in a job. You can save our people. and pushed her. And maybe God has put you in this place for this very reason. And Mordecai pushed her to make that decision. And Wilberforce had Newton, as well as his associates, in what would become the Clapham sect. It's called the Clapham sect. It was a group of reformers who sought social reform in a wide number of areas. He also had the support of John Wesley. There's just a picture of John Wesley. John Wesley was a famous Methodist preacher throughout the 1700s. And on his deathbed, he wrote a letter to Wilberforce, encouraging him to continue on in the faith and not abandon his task to see slavery eliminated. And I give you this example as an example of having people who speak into your life. And who knows how many times Wilberforce read that letter. It's one of the last letters John Wesley ever wrote. How many times did he read that letter just to receive encouragement from that sage, godly church leader who was long dead? Well, we need to make sure we're surrounded by people that are the right people to speak into our lives, pray for us, fast for us, and encourage us in the faith. We need patience. Esther needed to act quickly because the Jews are going to get killed. But then she needed to, once the plan was made, had to sort of act carefully and let her plan unfold in due time. Wilberforce needed to be patient, for it would take decades to overthrow such a powerful institution of planters and businessmen and ship owners and traditionalists and the crown. His bills, consider this, his bills to get slavery abolished were defeated in 1791, 1792, 1793, 1797, 1798, 1804, 1805, 1807 a bill was passed that abolished the trade but not slavery itself. Another 26 more years to see the final abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And so if you're saying, well, Gord, I tried to bring change in my workplace. I tried to show love and grace and mercy, and I tried to bring some justice, or I feel like I'm called to be here, but things aren't happening as quickly as I want them to. Just remember William Wilberforce. Failure after failure after failure after failure after failure after failure after failure, year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. But at the end of the day, what happened? On his deathbed, slavery was abolished. Took his life to bring it about. But patience, continuing in the task, recognizing that God had placed him there for that very reason. And finally, we need courage. What Mordecai was asking Esther to do was very risky, and one false move could end her life. And we know as Christians that doing the right thing does not guarantee that we will live. Right? There are martyrs. People die for doing the right thing. So there's no guarantee that doing the right thing will guarantee our life. Because again, there are martyrs. But Esther had courage. What Wilberforce faced were years of mockery and ridicule, for powerful interests were threatened by his reform movements. He could have lost his job. There are incredible amounts of money and energy every election to try and get him overthrown. But he always won, kept coming back for more, and he paid a great price in terms of his health. He already had poor eyes, and his work made him worse. He had colitis. He had a weak body that often needed to be held up by a metal frame. And he had to rely on the medicine of the day, which was opium, for pain relief, for his colitis. And with that opium use, small opium use, of course, but with that came the risks that came with opium use. Hallucinations, sickness, amnesia, and depression. So in the midst of that, he needed courage and strength and God's grace to carry out the task that was before them. So these are some lessons we can learn, and there's lots more there, but my time is up. So let me conclude. And I'd like to conclude with a story not of a queen and not of a member of parliament, but with a king from the 11th century. You can tell I'm a historian. I love these stories. In the 11th century, King Henry III of Bavaria grew tired of court life. And I'm reading from one author's book called Awakened to Destiny. And so he tells this story. In the 11th century, King Henry III of Bavaria grew tired of court life and the pressures of being a monarch. He made application to Prior Richard at a local monastery, asking to be accepted as a contemplative and spend the rest of his life in the monastery. He's tired of being a politician. He just wants to rest in a monastery. Your Majesty, said Prior Richard, do you understand that the pledge here is one of obedience? And that will be hard because you've been king. I understand, said Henry. The rest of my life I will be obedient to you as Christ leads you. Then I will tell you what to do, said Prior Richard. Go back to your throne and serve faithfully in the place where God has put you. When King Henry died, a statement was written, the king learned to rule by being obedient. And then this author concludes, when we tire of our roles and responsibilities, it helps to remember God has planted us in certain places and told us to be a good accountant or teacher or mother or father. Christ expects us to be faithful where he puts us. Final words. I'm not sure what your vocation is. I'm not sure what your job is, what your calling is. And whether or not you should leave it for something else. Because there is a time when it's right to leave. So I'm not saying you can never leave. But I do know this. You should not leave your job because you think it could never have anything to do with your vocation as a Christian. For, who knows but that you have come to your job for such a time as this.